Before I get into today's episode, I'd like to take a minute and tell you about Obscure History's exclusive content. Do you see that button there that says subscribe on your iPhone, on Apple Podcasts, which is most likely where you're listening to this? If you click that button and subscribe, you'll get access to bonus content. You'll notice subscriber-only episodes showing up in your feed. They're just like the regular episodes, except for there is a bit of bonus information at the end, just for you. My goal is to have 100 subscribers in the next 6 months, and I think that's totally possible because you guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Consider subscribing today. Have you ever lost your wallet? Even if you've just lost it for a moment, even if you're just in your own house, it's a dreadful experience. The moment that you realize it's not where it should be, the blood drains from your face and that feeling of terror settles like iron in your stomach. Sometimes the search lasts only for a few moments. Other times, it could take a whole afternoon. But what if you had that feeling for a decade? Or 2? Or 3? My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. It was a brisk spring morning in Boston, 1990. Paul Calantropo was preparing his office for what he'd hoped would be an eventful day of business. A career art and jewelry appraiser, Calantropo must have had wild fantasies about what amazing items might be brought into his office each day. Would he be appraising a priceless artifact, some long-lost Van Gogh or Picasso? Or would he spend his time trying to find a gentle way to tell grieving customers that their Nana's heirloom jewelry was actually costume props from a community theater version of Romeo and Juliet? Before his day could really begin, a familiar face entered the office holding a familiar-looking armload. Bobby Donati and Paul Calantropo had been friends since childhood. Though they were still friendly, their paths had diverged long ago. The two men, now in their 50s, caught up about the good old days as Donati unwrapped the package he had come in with. The hair on Calantropo's neck must have been standing on end. Donati's business had come to make him nervous. Though he kept far enough away to keep out of the specifics, it wasn't exactly a secret that Bobby Donati was associated with some of Boston's most notorious criminals. As the last layers of covering were pulled off the artwork in Donati's hands, Calantropo immediately knew something was desperately wrong. It wasn't a painting, or sculpture, or piece of pottery. It was an 11-inch tall bronze eagle finial. Specifically, it was the 11-inch tall bronze eagle finial that had once sat atop a Napoleonic flagpole. Even more specifically, it was the 11-inch tall bronze eagle finial that had been stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum only a couple of months prior. Calantropo, shocked, looked at his childhood friend and said, "Jesus, Bobby, why didn't you just steal the Mona Lisa?" And after some debate, the two parted ways. Donati back into the streets where he had come from, fading into the crowds with a priceless artifact, and Calantropo left alone in his office, trying to plan his next move. Should he go to the police? Donati was a trusted childhood friend. Would Calantropo really be able to betray that confidence? He was also tied to some very powerful mob families. Would Calantropo actually be safe if he went to the authorities? He got his answer when Donati was found murdered, shoved in the trunk of his own car, and abandoned in a parking lot. Calantropo would later comment that he felt pretty crestfallen at the news of his friend's murder. Not only because of the personal loss, but because in his opinion, Bobby Donati took the secret of the stolen art's location to his grave. And Calantropo wasn't the only one who was suspicious of Donati. Sitting behind bars at the time of the heist was the man who would have almost certainly been at the top of the FBI's suspect list, had he not been locked up at the time. Though he very clearly did not commit the crime, Miles J. Connor eventually told the FBI that, "I know emphatically and beyond any doubt who stole the art." And he elaborated that he had, in fact, scoped out the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum with 2 associates in 1975. He even told the authorities that hitting the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was on his bucket list. While these claims may seem outlandish, the authorities had every reason to believe Connor. He had committed dozens of art heists, claimed to be responsible for dozens more that the police were never privy to, and professed his disappointment at the jobs he was never able to complete. Connor had also expertly used art to bargain with authorities in the past. In 1975, he arranged the return of a Rembrandt for a lighter sentence. The Rembrandt was worth $1 million at the time. Even though the authorities knew that he hadn't committed the crime, they still wanted to hear him out, especially after he told them that whoever stole the artwork had used his plan. The other man that Connor had mentioned was a career criminal named David Houghton. In fact, according to Connor, it was Houghton who visited him in prison after the heist to tell him all the juicy details. According to Connor, he knew that Donati and Houghton had committed the heist because Houghton told him as much. It was a pretty solid lead. One of the most prolific art thieves of the day was telling the authorities that his 2 associates had completed a plan they had all made up together years prior, and that he could probably get the artworks back. But he was locked up behind bars, and unfortunately, just like Donati, Houghton had died shortly after the heist. Unlike Donati, he died of natural causes. Regardless, the authorities were sort of at a stalemate. The 2 people most likely involved with the theft were both 6 feet under. The trail seemed as if it were going cold. That is, until Connor turned the authorities toward a mob associate and antique dealer named Henry Youngworth. As the FBI tends to do, they immediately began surveilling Youngworth and conducting raids on some of his businesses, desperately trying to find the missing Gardner loot. While they did not find what they were after, their activity did attract the attention of journalist Tom Mashberg. Mashberg began talking with Youngworth in 1997, and the 2 began working together cautiously. According to author Stephen Kirkjian, one night in August 1997, Youngworth called Mashberg and told him that he had proof he could return the Gardner paintings under the right conditions. That night, Youngworth picked up Mashberg from the Boston Herald offices and drove him to a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Youngworth led him inside to a storage unit with several large cylinder tubes. He removed one of the paintings from its tube, unfurled it, and showed it to Mashberg under flashlight. It appeared to Mashberg to be the storm on the Sea of Galilee. He noticed cracking along the canvas, and the edges were cut in a manner consistent with the museum's reports, as well as Rembrandt's signature on the ship's rudder. Mashberg reported his experience in the Boston Globe, hiding Youngworth's identity for his protection. Though the experience was awfully convincing, the most damning evidence was that Youngworth mentioned that Donati was one of the robbers on the inside of the museum that night in 1990, and that Houghton had been the transport hauling the art away to the storage unit where it was locked away until the authorities were ready to strike a deal. But that deal would never come. A few months after Mashberg's breakthrough article ran in the Globe, the FBI were able to pinpoint the location of the storage unit that Youngworth and Mashberg had visited. They raided the warehouse. They found nothing. Despite a fruitless storage unit raid, the FBI were able to establish communication with Youngworth and began the dangerous and meticulous business of working together to solve the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. However, the longer that they worked together, the farther away a solution seemed. Using Mashberg as an intermediary, Youngworth supplied paint chips for federal authorities to analyze, and they reported that they were indeed from Rembrandt's era but did not match the oils used for the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Additionally, the way Mashberg described the painting as being unfurled was also scrutinized by the authorities, as the stolen painting was covered in a heavy varnish that would not roll easily. Youngworth also made it difficult for authorities to solve the case by demanding full immunity and the immediate release of his friend and associate, Miles Connor. Due to the shaky nature of the evidence provided and the increasingly difficult communications with Youngworth, the FBI and the museum refused to work with him any longer unless he could provide better evidence. Youngworth again provided a vial of paint chips, purportedly from the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and 25 color photographs of the painting, and a lady and gentleman in black. After processing the data, a joint statement from the museum and federal investigators announced that the chips were not from the stolen Rembrandts, though they did test as being from the 17th century paintings, and could potentially be from Vermeer's The Concert. And with that, the case went cold for a time. Eventually, the FBI would come to a conclusion, for better or worse, I suppose. But before we get to that, let's pay the bills. Hang tight for about 90 seconds, and when we return, we'll get to the very curious end of this tale. After the Youngworth trail had seemed to reach its end, journalist Stephen Kirkjian reached out to infamous mobster Vincent Ferrara, better known as the Animal. Kirkjian was able to secure a conference with Ferrara and probed about the Gardner heist. Just as Youngsworth, Connor, and Calantropo had, Ferrara also pinned the robbery on Bobby Donati. Incredibly, he was able to illuminate the situation even further. According to Ferrara, Donati claimed to have buried the artwork and would start a negotiation for his release once the investigation cooled down. He also indicated that crime boss Carmelo Merlino may be involved. Those negotiations never came, though. Before Donati could even start the negotiations, he was killed, a casualty of the Boston mob gang wars. So here we are, completely gridlocked. 4 reliable witnesses pinned Bobby Donati as the mastermind behind the heist. And it seemed that somehow he hid the paintings, either in David Houghton's warehouse or maybe even underground. But he was dead, and Houghton was dead, and Youngworth was completely written off as a reliable witness by the authorities. And Ferrara was in jail. So you can imagine the surprise the FBI felt when they began receiving mysterious letters with some tantalizing details in them. According to journalist Stephen Kirkjian, in 1994, the director of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, Anne Hawley, received a letter from an anonymous author. Postmarked from New York City, it read like it had been written by a professional, perhaps a lawyer. In the second sentence, it offered a piece of information that had never been before made public. The uniforms the thieves had worn as disguises had not been those of police officers, but rather of security guards. I want to point out that I had no part in the theft, the unknown individual wrote, and really only became aware of it in the past 6 months. Further, I do not know the identity of the 2 men who did the actual robbery. I am dealing with a third party. All parties do want a resolution to everyone's satisfaction. You get the collection, and they get some money and immunity from prosecution. The plan seemed simple. The FBI were to pay this mysterious third-party arbiter, who would in turn pay their contacts, who would in turn pay the thieves. Then, the FBI would anonymously get back their precious loot. The author continued by stating, "I will make no contacts that could be traced. I fear an overzealous federal agent will try to grab some headlines too soon." The author also instructed the authorities to work with the Boston Globe to communicate further. They asked that a number 1 be marked in a very particular section of the currency box in the May 1st, 1994 edition. They insisted, for example, this week the lira in American dollars is 0.000618. The letter writer noted that using that as a baseline, the following formula must be used to indicate your interest. Not interested equals 0.000618. Agree equals 1.000618. The FBI and the Globe complied and ran the May 1st, 1994 edition with the special marker as requested. They received a second letter shortly after the publication of that edition. It read, in all caps, "You cannot have both." It continued by saying, "Right now I need time to both think and start the process to ensure confidentiality of the exchange." If the anonymous writer decided that it was impossible to continue with the negotiation, they would provide the museum with some clues to the artwork's whereabouts, but they would close contact. They stipulated that if the authorities continued their investigations during this time in any way, the deal was off. The museum never received another letter, though. In later reports, one agent assigned to the case at the time confirmed he had been directed by supervisors not to investigate the dealings any further. But that same agent said that other investigators had continued to pursue leads on the case. It seemed as if the FBI really dropped the ball on this potential lead, and Museum Director Ann Hawley knew it. She petitioned other branches of the FBI to get more attention on the case. She even reached out to the Pope himself, asking for the Vatican's resources in finding the paintings, particularly Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. In her petition, she convincingly argued, for people who find it hard to imagine the enormity of this, who are maybe musically oriented or theatrically oriented, to imagine what if Beethoven's Fifth Symphony could never be heard again, or what if Louis Armstrong's work could never again be heard, or what if Hamlet could never once more be played. I mean, these are works of a civilization that are so important. To remove them is to remove a piece of our civilization. But no matter how hard she petitioned, help never really arrived. And that's where the investigation sat for years. Decades, maybe. We had a few strong witnesses pinning the crime on a long-dead, low-level mob associate. We had a few suspicious paint chips from a known criminal antique and fine art dealer, but those had ultimately been counted out as potential matches to the lost works. We had a mysterious letter with some convincing details. The kind of details only somebody with first-hand knowledge would know. But an aggressive FBI campaign seemed to have shut those doors forever. Investigators had been so close, so many times. But in 2015, the FBI made a shocking and confusing announcement. Sarah Cascone of ArtNet reports that, contrary to all of the previous investigation and testimony, the names of the perpetrators of the notorious crime have finally been released. The two robbers were George Reisfelder and Lenny DeMuzio, both of whom died within a year of the heist. The two men belonged to the crew of local criminal Carmelo Merlino, who was first mentioned in connection with the 25-year-old robbery way back in 1992. Reisfelder and DeMuzio have also been suspects in the case for many years, but their role in the burglary is only now being confirmed. The FBI announced last year that they had identified who was responsible and revealed details about the investigation over the years, but declined to name names. Merlino arranged the now infamous heist, probably at the behest of another unknown party, in which Reisfelder and DeMuzio dressed as Boston police officers in order to trick the night watchman into letting them in. Then, they took their time, stealing 13 artworks including Rembrandt's only seascape, The Storm in the Sea of Galilee, and Vermeer's The Concert, which could be worth as much as $250 million today. Less than a year later, however, Reisfelder died from a drug overdose and DeMuzio was murdered, possibly because Merlino discovered a planned coup he was leading. So where did these names come from? How did the investigation take such a sharp left turn? It's unclear, exactly. The FBI keeps information about the heist relatively private because it is still an open case. Later, in 2015, the FBI reported seeing some of the artworks for sale on the black market in Philadelphia, but failed to disclose any further information. Perhaps, as I've seen suggested by some journalists, the FBI simply doesn't want the case to close. Having a looming case that involved prominent mob families certainly kept the door open for warrants and raids that maybe they wouldn't have had legal grounds for otherwise. I'm sure that it was a valuable tool. In fact, I believe I've mentioned 2 separate raids in this episode alone, and I'll talk about a few more in the exclusive subscriber-only version of this episode. Maybe they just don't really care that much. I mean, think about it. It's 13 paintings and some sculptures and an eagle finial. In comparison to the literal mob war that was taking place in Boston in the 1990s, some missing art doesn't seem like such a high priority, no matter its cultural or monetary value. Until the case closes, however, the FBI will keep those documents sealed, and we'll probably never know exactly why they did what they did or what they knew when they knew it. And considering how slowly this case has evolved, we likely never will. Regardless, if you have any information about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, contact the museum immediately. You will be financially compensated if you can in any way facilitate the return of the priceless works of art that were stolen that spring morning in 1990. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this series. I know that I enjoyed making it. If you are a subscriber, stick around. Go listen to the subscriber-only version of this to get the extra special outro information. Otherwise, I'd like to let you know, as always, that this episode is brought to you in part by Earbuds Podcast Collective and Indie Drop-In Network. Ariel and Greg are 2 of the most solid people out here in the podcast industry, and they will help you find your second favorite show. It's awfully presumptuous of me to think that this is your favorite show. However, I'd like to think that it is for some of you. So with that said, I've got to get out of here. I don't have any very exciting and fun announcements. Like I said, if you'd like all of the bonus information, including some details on a couple of extra FBI raids, then hop over, push that subscribe button in your Apple Podcast player. You'll get access to the subscriber-only versions of this episode, where after this outro right here, you would be hearing different stuff. So anyways, I got to get out of here. I'll talk to you guys later.